So welcome everybody. So I'm Jo Blundell. I'm one of the co-directors of Place Matters. I'll get our colleagues first of all to intro themselves, put their hand up, wave, pull a face, whatever. But I'll introduce you and you can wave. How about that? That's better. Layla, do you want to, you're next. So it's Layla Kabara, fellow co-director, Emily Sun, fellow co-director, and Polly Orton, who's on my screen, we're on the bottom there. So we're the Place Matters team, most of the Place Matters team. We're joined today by two members of the Bridgespan Group. In fact, two of the members, I think I can say this, guys, that were the authors and originators of the term field building, which we're going to explore today. So we're very honoured the people who invented it. I hope I'm not overclaiming to your celebrity there, guys, but perhaps you could just wave. So Emma Nothman from Bridgespan and Leah Farnham from Bridgespan too. So a little bit of a scene setter as we kind of get everyone in the room. So we've been thinking and exploring the idea of field building for a little while now. And essentially, as you might imagine from an organisation, it calls itself Place Matters. We're quite keen on place, and we think that working at a place level is incredibly important because I'm singing to the choir here, but as you all know, it's where the system, in our view, makes the most sense. It's where we can see the interconnectedness of issues. We can see the impact at a human level of the system on people. We can engage the assets of the community. So this is all about, so place is incredibly important. But in our view, there's a place and what we mean by that is that one of the downsides of living on place is that by the very definition, it works in generally small geographies with smaller communities on local issues that are important to those communities. So what we wanted to explore today was how we might think about scaling the connectedness of people working at place, so that where there are common themes or issues or challenges, there's a way of bringing people together to scale the impact they have collectively, to share learning, to be essentially better at doing the work in place by being together in some way. And I think the big challenge in this work for many of us is that although intuitively or actually we understand that working in place creates a powerful impact because it brings people, for all sorts of reasons, it brings people with us on that journey. It uses those assets in the community. It reaches in a more equitable way than perhaps many other ways of working on change with communities. There are, those downsides are of creating that kind of scale and longevity and evidence by sharing evidence, by having a collective narrative, a collective voice to the work. So now, there's no silver bullet to that, and field building is actually one of the ways in which we might create those connectedness, but we think it's a very rich way of thinking about this work. Now, as ever, it's a bit like collective impact. It's a way of framing, in many ways, what's often happening already. So this is not a sort of, ta-da, it's new, but often with frameworks, it's a way of understanding our work, reflecting on our work, giving a language to it so we can talk about it together. And that's essentially what we wanted to do today, is to think about what is field building, what have Bridgespan in their research and their experience around this learnt about what field building is all about, and have a conversation where we can see perhaps some of the shoots of that will be happening in the UK, and let's share some of our collective knowledge of where that's happening, which we'll do when we get to a later part of the session. But we are sort of looking at the opportunity for using field building as a way in which we might approach a more collective and collaborative way of working, of sharing what we do, sharing what we know, in order we're sort of bigger than the sum of our part, bigger than the sum of our parts. So that was what today was all about. So the format is we're going to spend a bit of time with Bridgespan sharing their knowledge and experience with us in the usual way through PowerPoint. If in that first part you could log any questions or thoughts or things that you'd like to clarify in the discussion. If Bridgespan have said that you'd like to pick up with them and and ask any questions or have a further discussion about, we'll do that first. Then we'll move on to a plenary discussion where we like to sort of think about what that means for you. What have you heard? We've got a series of questions which I'll share a bit further down the line about things that we think might be interesting to explore, but we don't want to exclusively, generate those questions. You might have your own thoughts about what you'd like to delve in, but we'll use the chat just to log things that you think might be interested. But we'll see how it's a big group, so we'll see how a plenary goes. If that doesn't work because we're a big group and people don't feel comfortable sharing in a big group, with the plan B that we'll go into a little breakout groups and just give people a chance to talk in smaller groups and come back and share. But we're going to see how it goes. That's okay, and see what the energy is like in the room. The final thing is that we will ask you at the end, we're going to do a little poll, which is an experiment. I've not done a poll before. Hopefully that's going to work. But just to ask you how you'd like to, and if you'd like to, with no obligation, to take the discussion forward in some ways. We just like to get it's just really for us to get a sense of where's the energy in the room to move on with this thought about field building, coming together, perhaps to explore what it means in smaller groups, in smaller workshops, etc. So we'll just take a dip check on what you'd like to do, and there's no obligation to share that, but there's the opportunity to do that if you'd like to continue with the discussion in some way. So if that's okay with everybody, clear enough. Any questions, thoughts, objections before we go on? So what we'll do now is, Emma, Leah, I'll invite you to share your thoughts for the next few minutes.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Joe and Leila and Emily, for having us, and wonderful to see so many faces here, some familiar and some new. Leah and I will plan to walk through a set of slides over the next 20-30 minutes, but please feel free to pop into the chat with questions along the way, and we'll either answer them as we go or tackle them all together at the end. Our goals are really just to introduce you all to Bridgespan and give a little bit of context on who we are and how we come to this work and this research. I don't think we can claim to have coined the phrase field building, though maybe field catalyst. And but we have done a lot of research over the last several years around field building, what it looks like, and so we're eager to share that with you. And then specifically do a little bit of a deeper dive on what does it look like to develop a field level agenda, and then hopefully make this as relevant as we can for each of you, so answering any and all of y'all's questions. Maybe before I dig into just a quick overview of Bridgespan, I'll note that Leah and I are partners at Bridgespan. We both are coming to you today from San Francisco, from the Bay Area, in the States, and both of our backgrounds prior to Bridgespan and prior to this field building work was in education. And so a lot of the questions that we were asking around field building, around education, they come from that frustration of gosh, how do you actually make impact at scale in this work? So that's a lot of what you'll hear us talking about, is really coming from that animating question. So if we go into the next slide, I'll just quickly run through a couple slides about Bridgespan. We are a nonprofit organization, really seeking to make the world a better place by strengthening mission-driven organizations, impact investors, and philanthropists. We work globally. We have offices in Boston, New York, San Francisco, Johannesburg, Mumbai, and Singapore. The next slide, we have sort of 4 bodies of work that are core to our theory of change. One we're probably best known for our strategy consulting and advising for philanthropy and impact investing. But we also do leadership development, working in cohorts of leaders. And then the piece of Bridgespan that you're really hearing from today, Leah and I are coming from, is around the part of our theory of change that's around knowledge sharing. So doing practical research that is surfacing really like sort of concrete, tangible, practical approaches to answering the questions that are emerging from our consulting work. So if we go to the next slide, I mentioned Leah and I are coming from the knowledge sharing side. We co-lead Bridgespan's Field Building for Equitable Systems Change initiative. And the goal of that is to see funders significantly increase their funding and support for field building as an approach, and for the field catalysts, which are a kind of organization we'll talk about, the ones that lead the way to field building impact. And the other goal is to see field catalysts fully funded and really equipped to sustain effective and adapting field building efforts. So we approach that through direct work with funders, doing peer learning, as well as thought leadership and dissemination, and then through supporting field catalysts and amplifying stories and narratives of the ways in which field catalysts have been effective in terms of leading the way to impact. And so you see at the bottom a set of pieces that we have researched and published over the last several years. And the insights that we'll share today really come from that ongoing body of research. All right, so we'll dive in to just an overview of field building. On the next slide, yeah, you'll see, you'll hear us talk about systems change, about field building, about field catalysts, and it's helpful just to start with a grounding of like, how are all these things interconnected? And I should note, like, hold all of these definitions quite loosely, but we think about systems change as the addressing the root causes of social issues, requiring many actors and the use of multiple levers. We then see field building as an approach to tackling systems change, and then field catalysts, a really specific type of NGO intermediary that is coordinating frequently behind the scenes efforts to build the field and support systems change work. So what is a field? What is field building? Just quick definitions. We think about fields as a set of individuals and organizations who are working together to address a common social issue or problem. And then field building is really the activities and investments that together unlock a field's progress. The next slide, there are a couple different kinds of fields that we think about. Here we've named problem-based fields and issue-based fields. The reality is that fields come at multiple sort of scopes and altitudes, and these are two ways that we have two archetypes that we have found particularly common and helpful in terms of thinking about and understanding what the boundaries of a field actually are. Whereas a issue-based field might be broad, think secondary education, public health. There are sort of containers for relationships, for learning, but it's hard to make progress at that scale. And so what we see, and you sort of see this illustrative diagram underneath issue-based fields, lots of smaller, more bounded problem-based fields that emerge from typically broader issue-based fields that are really tackling something that's outwardly visible and has a measurable outcome and solution. So the example here of, tackling bail reform, where the problem is, money bonds disproportionately penalize low-income individuals. That's a way to really bound the field and therefore the actors and efforts required to tackle it. On the next slide, this is, when we talk about field building being the activities required to unlock a field's progress, just to double click underneath that, there are these three components that we talk about. One is defining the field, and I'll give on the next slide just a little bit more sort of suggestions and ways to think about bounding the field. But what are we trying to do together? What is the vision for what this looks like? The second piece is around diagnosing and assessing the field. So really understanding what's the state of the field today, what's the progress that has been achieved, and what will be required to unlock that next set of progress. And then the third piece is working together in coalitions. What are the shared priorities that collectively we want to pursue to build the field and make progress towards that goal? So see those three interconnected pieces in iteration is really what allows for progress and continuous learning and engagement. So the next slide, we talk a little bit about what does it look like to define the field? And I'll name a couple examples here. There are some discrete choices to make around the problem scope and the geography or altitude of the system. One could define the problem quite broadly, and that requires, a large number of actors. Conversely, a tighter problem definition requires a smaller number of actors to really make progress, but there are some trade-offs in terms of potentially exclusivity and missing broader opportunities and needs. Joe at the beginning also described sort of the interconnection between place-based work and broader field building efforts, and we see that really frequently as like a choice around the altitude of the system that field building efforts are working at. And then just a couple other sort of considerations in thinking about how to define the field. We frequently see field building coalitions and groups of actors grappling with, what is our timeline for this? Is this multi-generational work? Is this, are we trying to achieve a specific outcome in the context of, say, a decade? Grappling with sort of incremental change and the present set of systems that we are faced with versus imagining a future we aspire to and thinking about what are the sets of actors and solutions that will be required in that future. And then the last piece I'll name is moments of rightness. We see frequently new research, policy changes, or externalities, events that happen in our world, creating unique opportunities for rapid progress in field building efforts. So if we keep going, I'll share a couple insights from our research. Two sets of patterns here that I think are really helpful to ground us in. One, we studied over 35 different social change fields, really trying to understand this question of how do social change fields make progress towards impact at scale. And we did see a number of these patterns, one of which is they follow this established trajectory of moving on the left-hand side from an emerging phase where impact is really scattered. There aren't a ton of different actors working in the field, to on the right-hand side, we call evolving and sustaining, where impact towards the sort of the aspiration of impact at scale. The field is moving towards that rapidly. There's a large number of actors working in concert together, connected by the right kinds of infrastructure, supported by the right kinds of resources. And we see that across the social change fields we studied, not a ton of them reach this right-hand side. In fact, many are in this emerging and forming stage, but we do see a discrete set of patterns that we think we can learn from to support a broader set of fields to make further progress along the spectrum. We go to the next slide. The other important pattern to call out is that as fields make progress across that spectrum that we just shared, we can see these 6 characteristics make progress as well. So we can analyze and understand a field's progress by analyzing and understanding these characteristics. And I'll just run through them really quickly because it's helpful. This is one of the elements of the research that it's like, once you sort of see and understand this, you can't really unsee it. And I find myself looking around in every context in every field that I come across and I'm working in, trying to understand what is the knowledge base, who all is involved in this work. So you just sort of ask yourself this set of questions and checklist. So the first is a robust knowledge base. And this is really, think about it as both the academic research as well as practical research that helps everyone understand what is the magnitude of the problem, what are the issues at hand, and how are we making progress towards impact. And it is I name academic and practical knowledge because the translation of academic knowledge into the right hands to make it actionable is really important and a critical part of this characteristic. The actors characteristic is obviously also critical. This is really, do we have the right people and organizations and leaders who are engaged in this work, who see themselves as working on this problem, and who are engaged in a meaningful way. And this is particularly critical to think about proximate leadership, and diversity, as well as the heterogeneity, different kinds of actors, research, direct service, all those kinds of levers. The third one here I'll name is just public sector systems. This is one that truthfully in our original research, we saw as embedded within a couple of these other characteristics, but as we've done further research, we've called out on its own as particularly critical in many contexts to consider. And this is just, what are the intersections with public sector systems?
And Emma, I'll pause you for a minute there, because we had a question in the chat. Thank you, Mike, which is, what connections, if any, do you see between field building and mission-led government? And I won't pretend to say we've studied in depth mission-driven government or mission-led government, though I suspect many of you are really thinking about that right now, and we're certainly tracking what that might mean in the context of the UK in particular. But I think we have some hypotheses based on some other global contexts that really were the places that elevated this sixth characteristics, because in our original framework, I will say a lot of our examples were US or global north based. As we really went deeper on this work in India in particular, colleagues there elevated, we actually can't do anything that gets to population level impact or at scale without public sector and government at the table involved in the work and aligning on goals. And so I would name a hypothesis that I would have in thinking about mission-led governments is, if there are these 5 or 6 or whatever it ends up being, like missions or aims that are these like social and environmental aims, like we see that as such an important part of field building in the examples we've studied, that groups are coming together and aligning around a shared goal or a shared aim. And here in the US, one of the examples a historical example we studied was teen pregnancy in the 90s. And it was, this galvanizing moment when President Bill Clinton, and I think it was in the mid 90s, said from the presidential pulpit, teen pregnancy is the social issue of our time. And while I will not call the US government a mission-led government, they've certainly never said that themselves, that was this galvanizing moment where the president was saying, this is the social issue. We need to align and bring depth and more resources to that issue. And, indeed, we saw this field built around that, which had already been years in the making, to be clear. This wasn't like Bill Clinton invented the issue and the field around it at all. In fact, it was years of field building that led to him having that galvanizing moment from the presidential pulpit. But that was really critical. And in many contexts, probably all, but, we're still kind of figuring out how to actually assess this with the data. Government really being a part of and at the table is essential, and having those shared aims and using kind of the governmental public sector resources, actors, power, all of those things toward shared aims with a broader field of civil society, philanthropy, et cetera, is really powerful. And I think I will just name one tension with that. In some contexts, fields are really pushing on government actors and wouldn't say, oh, we share aims. They're actually hoping that eventually we might share aims and missions, but they're really pushing toward that versus feeling like that's possible from the outset. And in other contexts, it's like we actually are in relationship with some set of critical actors. And so we believe we can get to some shared aims, including government actors earlier in the field building journey. Also, my dear partner and friend Emma has been losing her voice over the last week. So Emma, I hope that little reprieve gave you a little bit of a break to have a sip of water while you wrap up this section. And thanks again for the question, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for that question, Mike. That was great. I will run us quickly through the last 3 characteristics here, and then I'll dive us into an example that just sort of shows and illustrates how does a field make progress from the earliest days to impact at scale. Okay, so the 4th characteristic to name is field level agenda, and this is, as sort of we highlighted earlier, the combination of understanding what is the definition of a field, what is the current state, and what are the opportunities in front of us, those of us who are leading the way in that field. Two, what do we want to take on together? So this is really the combination of approaches that leaders want to pursue in order to unlock that next stage of progress and development. And then resources. This is both financial and non-financial resources that are supporting the work of the field. And so a lot of times the work of Field Catalyst is figuring out how to bring more resources into the field and have them reach the right places in order to realize the full potential of the work. The last characteristic is adaptive infrastructure, and that's at the center for a reason, because that is really the connective tissue that allows for actors to learn from each other, to work with each other. It enables that innovation and collaboration over time. The approaches obviously will change, but that core principle is really critical for fields to grow and make progress. So let's dive into an example of the malaria eradication field. And I'll just quickly provide this narrative before I turn it over to Leah to take us into some more detail about Field Catalyst specifically. This story is one, some of you may know this, of malaria really wreaking havoc in the 1980s and 90s. Malaria deaths rose, 3x in that period. And it led to a number of multinational bilateral organizations coming together to found an organization called Rollback Malaria, whose sort of mission and goal was not to provide bed nets or other sort of direct service interventions to people with malaria, but rather to coordinate a global response. Working across different actors, providing research, activating research in order to figure out what was going to work under what conditions, and then really shining a spotlight on the issue, galvanizing resources and the requisite policy and administrative changes that would unlock a lot of the organizations working in that space to be more effective. So between 2005 and 2015, there was a lot of success, and it ended up being one of the greatest public health successes, honestly, of our time. But it didn't start out that way. In fact, malaria deaths, Rollback Malaria was founded in 1998, but malaria deaths actually continued to rise until 2004. And you could imagine a world, if you're the leader of Rollback Malaria or the organizations who came together to found it, where you're saying, gosh, we are funding this organization to reduce malaria deaths, but actually malaria deaths are rising. Like, we must be doing something really wrong. But we're also grateful that they stayed the course and didn't actually change their plan or start providing bed nets or anything like that. Rather, it just is a reminder that field building work takes time, because by the time they got into this forming stage, they had managed to activate nearly $2 billion of new funding into malaria eradication and coordinate a global response such that we were able collectively to see that dramatic decline in deaths. And then on the right-hand side here, it's just such a reminder that this work is never static, despite that great success. When COVID came along, there was a set of shifts and disruptions in the public health infrastructure such that there were new challenges created in that last mile delivery of direct services. So malaria deaths, in fact, have risen a little bit over the last decade or so, and Rollback Malaria is having, and the partnership more broadly, is having to really reimagine its work. This work is just never done. There's a reason why there are ings on that side of the diagram, and it's evolving and sustaining. So let me pause there and pass it to Leah.
Thank you, and thanks for the great questions in the chat. So appreciate the engagement. And I was just typing, Lynette, a couple thoughts to your question on have we looked at racial equity and racial justice using this model. And yes, we have. And Emma, you might actually pop in the 2021 piece, because in that one, we highlighted a specific field catalyst, the movement for Black Lives, which is different from BLM, Black Lives Matter, which is kind of the out front movement organization. But the movement for Black Lives, like many of the field catalysts we've studied, was much more behind the scenes, connecting, infrastructure building. And we've done a series of interviews over the last several years with leaders from the racial justice space. And it's one thing that I would name, going back to some of Emma's points about field definition, is that, in 2018-19, when we were starting some of this research, some of those leaders said, I don't know that field or field building is like the frame that I would use, though it feels like that's what philanthropy would use. And I will say, like, that is why we use those words, by the way. Like, philanthropic donors use that language and use that language with us. And so we thought, great, we want to unlock funding for this work, so let's meet donors where they are and use the term field building. But racial justice leaders were like, I had some hesitation about that because it feels more structured. One described it well, saying like, if that feels more like structured and professional, then I think some of us might envision our work in the racial justice movement. And then in 2020, with George Floyd's murder and with kind of this global racial reckoning in this pandemic moment, circling back with some of those leaders and hearing from them, they were like, you all talk about moments of ripeness in field building. This feels like one of these moments that's really galvanizing. And it is helpful to think about the field building lens as we want to sustain the momentum that we're seeing right now. And how are we really connecting folks, bringing them together, et cetera. And the movement for Black Lives played a big role in that here in the US. And with those successes, there is also a really significant anti-equity backlash that we're now seeing as well. So we could do a whole talk about that. So let me pause there for a moment and keep us moving, but also just really appreciate those questions. We've already started to talk a bit about field catalysts. We have a data set of over 100 of these organizations that we've been learning from, that we've surveyed, we've interviewed, and some are historical, many are living the work, doing the work today. Here are a few that we've studied, examples like with tobacco cessation, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, the Truth Initiative, with marriage equality in the US, Freedom to Marry, with homelessness, and organization Community Solutions. These are all organizations where, it's kind of impossible to do attributive causal research on this type of work, but we see like the presence of these organizations within a few years leading to significant population level impacts on the problems and issues that they're working on, whether that be teen smoking, malaria, as Emma just spoke to, addressing homelessness. And what's interesting about field catalysts is they're not household, NGO or nonprofits that you would have heard of. These are organizations that are sometimes intentionally working behind the scenes, and are working to support and disrupt power dynamics, distribute resources and power across the field, et cetera. And so they're not always the names out front. So what do field catalysts do? We keep talking about this really, really essential and important connective tissue role. Across those that we've studied, there are 3 roles that they all do. One is really diagnosing and assessing the field. Emma spoke to that really importance of understanding, like, what are we doing as a field? Who are we? And where are we along these characteristics that will indicate progress towards solving the problem we're working on? So field catalysts play this critical role of learning from all the different actors involved. Where are we in assessing the field's progress and opportunities? And they connect actors around a shared goal. Sometimes that is through convenings and bringing folks together in a really explicit way, connecting the work. Often it is behind the scenes of like, hey, funder, have you met, this person who's doing this research over here? You have these questions. I think they have the answer. Or a policy actor. You might want to learn from this practitioner who's at the cutting edge of this type of clinical, whatever. So essentially kind of brokering and ensuring that there are relationships across different types of actors in the field doing the work. Then, of course, advocating or shining a spotlight on the issue. Why are we working on this problem? Why does it matter? It's very tied to the diagnosing and assessing the field, but really like making the case for the field's work as well. And then they often have these kind of critical gap filling roles. Some do direct service. We were surprised to learn this in our research because we thought this is definitely an intermediary, not a direct service role. But we learned from many of these that there's can be a flywheel between some form of direct service. This is not often directly delivering programmatic work to individuals or families. It is more often a technical assistance type of role or capacity building for others. Some do re-granting. They pool funds and they try to attract resources and align them towards an agenda and then do re-granting. And then some do more specific advocacy work. And some have even started, separate tax, here in the US, they're called 501c4s, organizations that can do some lobbying work. And so some even expand into more direct political advocacy work, if that's needed by the field, and there's no one else doing that. I will name the article from 2021 that Emma linked in the chat. It's where we really elevated these assets that field catalysts bring. And that piece was in response to a question from funders about due diligence. They were kind of saying, okay, we're kind of waking up to this type of organization. We see that there are these organizations that it sounds like you're saying are going to be hard to find, because they're behind the scenes. But like, what are we looking for? Like, how do we even do diligence on them if they're not delivering programmatic work that we can actually see and count up and assess? And when we looked to interrogate that question and come up with some sort of answer, really, as we interviewed more and more of these field catalysts and the funders who fund them, is that they bring these assets that are nature different and really distinct. They bring this deep understanding of the problem and the ecosystem. And the flip side of that is, of course, this vision for what would it look like to solve that problem? What's that vision for equitable and durable population level change? And any field catalyst that's really effective in their work at any moment in time can speak to that deep, the problem and that vision really through the lens of the field actors. They're elevating all of the work that's happening in the field and how it's going to add up to something bigger than any given organization. That's this organizer's mindset. We borrow that from the world of community organizing, but this idea that you're looking out at the field and saying, what are the assets that exist? Who's doing what? And how do we bring it all together, coordinate, align, harmonize the field's work to actually get to our shared aims? And we heard in almost every interview some version of the phrase, this work happens at the speed of trusting relationships. It's all about relationships. And, I hope that as you hear that, that's resonant for the work that you all are doing. I know at the Place Matters team, we've talked about that a lot. This work happens at the speed of trust is another version of that. And so that's the fourth piece here, trusting relationships and credibility. And so appreciate the question earlier about, so are these independent organizations in civil society, in the public sector, and almost all of the organizations we studied are certainly independent from government. They're not always independent from philanthropy. And even, the smoking example is an interesting one because the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was committed to smoking cessation, put in $700 million over many years and played a really big role in that field's work. We'll talk more about philanthropy in a moment. So that is the work of field catalysts. And then lastly, I want to talk a bit about field level agenda and what we see in how field building funders approach their role as philanthropy in the field. Field building funders are really important. As we studied field catalysts, we really wanted to understand how they're funded and how they can be sustained and what they need to do this critical field building work that they drive. And, unfortunately, perhaps I might say their funding model relies on philanthropy, and you can imagine why that's the case. Like if there was a fee-for-service model or an earned revenue stream, like that disrupts the trusting relationships and power dynamics that you're trying to establish and build in the field. And so philanthropy plays such an essential role for these organizations. And, similarly, taking government grants would disrupt some of those relationships and power dynamics. And so funders are so important, but it's not just for the grants and support for field catalysts. Funders also have a really unique lens and vantage point on the field, often a balcony level view of what the field is doing. So funders play a critical role in helping to diagnose and assess the state of the field and support a power analysis, like where actually is power right now? Where do we need to disrupt that? Sometimes that may be recognizing philanthropy's role in the sector. Sometimes it might be recognizing government's role in the sector or others. Um, and then, of course, we see funders in terms of their own practice, really aligning grant making, not to what they as funders hold as their theory of change, but to the field's theory of change, which is often elevated and illuminated through the work of field catalysts. And then the number one question we hear from funders is about measurement. And so we have this last point here about funders, the paradigm that we have for measurement today, which in many cases still prizes things like the RCT, quasi-experimental analyses, it just is nature different than the work of field building. And so we need to evolve our approaches to measurement, evaluation, and learning to really encompass what the systems change work requires and looks like. For those funders in the audience, I will say we get asked the question, like, so where do I begin? Like, where do I even start if I want to start learning more, embracing this work? And the field diagnostic and really understanding where is the field today. You could use the framework that Emma just described with these characteristics that come from the 40 examples that we studied in our research. There are other frameworks out there. It's like the point is like aligning with the field on an understanding of where the work is. Like, what is the problem you're solving? Who's involved? Who's not involved? We actually have, if you're interested for download, a tool with different questions across these characteristics that could be prompts or conversation starters with other field actors to do this type of assessment. As I just said earlier, we call this the honeycomb. Field building funders have really important roles in not just wielding their power through things like grant making, but also building and sharing power. We take that building, wielding, sharing power from an organization, NCRP, I think it's the National Council for Responsive Philanthropy. They have a great report on power, building, wielding, and sharing by philanthropy. But you'll notice here, providing capital is only one of 6 themes that were elevated by the 100+ field catalysts that we've been engaged in the research. When we asked them, like, what do you need from funders to be successful in this systems change work? They said, well, like, we definitely need grants, like, sure, but we also really need support to build our organizational capacity. Many even talked about their individual relationships with funders almost as like a coaching relationship, like thought leadership, thought partnership, coaching. They need co-creation of measurement approaches that work. Number 4 down here at the bottom, this point about nurturing the genius within your existing portfolio. Many field catalysts said, we know other leaders who are in funder portfolios and who want to embrace and actually expand or explore the field catalyst role, but no one's asking them about that, or they don't feel supported. If funders actually looked within their existing portfolios, there's probably some burgeoning field catalysts already in their portfolios, people they already know. And then, of course, 5 and 6 here, funders can make connections across field actors. That's part of wielding power. And funders can use their platform and voice to bolster the field's messages. So as we wrap up here, just wanted to share a bit about a spectrum that we've seen in terms of how funders engage with field building. And this might spark some thoughts or reflections on your all's end. And it may spark some thoughts or reflections or connection to some of the questions earlier about the role of government, in particular in the UK context. Government can also be a funder of this work and plays its own distinct role. We see these examples from more field-driven over here with Beyond 100K, where, in this example, this is about STEM education. The work was sparked and supported by the Obama administration and the White House, and there was even a very small public funding stream to support STEM education. But very quickly, like, ownership and momentum in the field was very much field driven, and there was a field catalyst totally independent of government, but who benefited from that initial spark from government actors. And then the field's agenda was 100% set by the field, and in particular, existing STEM educators. All the way over to tobacco, where I named Robert Wood Johnson, played this. I mean, in many ways, they were the field catalyst before the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and the Truth Initiative were on the scene. And even once those organizations were on the scene, Robert Wood Johnson was like the primary funder, like the funder, and they continued to play an important quarterbacking role. And so, we see that spectrum. While I'm painting it almost as neutral, I will say like our research would indicate that like the field's ownership is essential for like durable systemic change. And so when we advise and support funders, often what we're working on is what will it take to really engage and build the field's capacity to own and direct and sustain this work over time. And then, across the bottom, we have a few of the key enablers. Sometimes that philanthropy itself can support in creating, bringing folks together, incentives to learn and collaborate and kind of break down the current incentives, which really create competition for grant funding. Research, the socio-political context matters. I suspect that's also relevant in your all's context right now. And then, of course, bringing new funding to bear. So I think with that, maybe we open up for discussion. We have a couple discussion questions here, and Joe would invite you back if there are other questions to pose to the group.
Thank you, guys. That was really awesome. I've heard that a couple of times. There's always something really new that comes out every time we hear it. And thank you for focusing a little bit on the funder role as well in this one, because I think that's an important thing. We want to open up a bit of discussion today. So before we go into sort of more of the plenary, thank you for posting some really interesting questions in the chat. Is there any questions that either Emma, Leah, you wanted to expand on a bit over and above what you've written in the chat and perhaps respond a bit more, or anyone wants to put their hand up so I can see you, and then put a question into the room? Appreciate it's a big room, but anyone's feeling brave. Just while you're thinking, I'm going to steal a question. You mentioned having a vision to solve a problem, and the sort of thought that came up for me was a lot of things that gets worked on by communities in place-based work are the kind of so-called complex adaptive work where we don't necessarily know where we're going to get to. And I wondered whether you could unpack a little bit the difference in your mind, or whether there might not be a difference between a vision that sets out, in a sense, I took from what you said, a confidence that change could happen and a sense of what might be the outcome, and that kind of complex evolutionary journey that we sometimes make in place-based change, where we might have an aspiration, we don't know how we're going to get there. So I wondered whether they're part of the same thing, or whether there's a difference in your mind.
I love that question, and Leah, I'm curious what this sparks for you too. What comes to mind to me immediately is, I think there's a difference between having a really like sort of concrete prescription for what the end state looks like versus a set of almost principles that inform how the group might prioritize what that future looks like. So like getting really specific, and that's part of why defining the field is so critical, is because it really forces everyone to understand, like in conversation with each other, by choosing this specific word to define the problem, does this actually mean that we care about, equity in this way, or we care about, like, this is really elevating policy change? It really forces that conversation. And it's at that level that we are sort of meaning it to describe that vision, that it's less about, we know that like this policy needs to look like ABC or something at that level, but more, we're all getting on the same page about what the most important levers are and how we'll know we get there when we do.
That's very helpful, thank you. Anybody else want to ask any questions by way of, or ask the question that they put in the chat to the room?
I see a new question in the chat, which maybe we could just verbally go to. You shared a really valuable model or image that was shared of various field actors. Has the role of communications, media, public broadcasting come up much in your research? If so, where and how? Great question. And I will say, one interesting edge in the research now has been around narrative and narrative change and public will. And so that question feels really, really resonant and important. And I think probably fair to say most, Emma, you can hold me to that. Most of the examples, maybe all, even that got to the far right side of that progression framework, there was a significant narrative public will building component to that work. And so, I don't know that we've gone so far as to like, every field level agenda should have that on it because it really should come from what the field sees as those most important opportunities. But in those cases where there was really significant narrative work, narrative change, and public will building, there was significant investment in messaging. Sometimes that was public, that was done through all the different type forms of media, and aligning on those messages was really important. Like even with smoking, and Joe, this goes to your question about even like what is the vision, and the work is messy and shifts. There's not like one answer, one agenda from the outset. Smoking started as like we want to like rid the world of smoking. But then like very early, I mean, we're going up against, we take this for granted now, but this movement like went up against big tobacco and these massive power players. And in the beginning, like that was kind of a non-starter vision. Just like smoking cessation overall, everyone was like, that's just not going to happen. But then through testing of messaging, testing like public will, like where was there public will? It was around young people smoking, which was the fastest growing population of new smokers were teens. And so then it was like, oh, people are actually willing to talk about youth smoking. And so then like the messaging went from there to this real galvanizing moment where, for I don't actually know globally if this was part of the overall messaging, but like, the big, like the old white guy sitting there with piles of money and this like kind of PSA that was like, when you smoke, this is who you're supporting. And all the young people, myself, one of them were like, what? So all to say, like, there are these like really like, visceral like moments and memories that were part of the narrative change work of many, and many of those were through public will building in media. So I love that question.
One other example to pop in, because I know there's a hand raise, I want to get there in a second, but one other example to share specifically on communications and narrative, because this is just a very tangible example of something that a funder can do. We've studied the Irvine Foundation in Cal, which is a California-based funder, and they, in committing to field building, they convened a set of their grantees in their, I think it was like one of their workforce development portfolios. And they specifically set aside, I think, 15% of their grant making envelope to have those grantees decide together, what else, what would you decide to support? What does this field need in order for you all to be successful? And the leader of the foundation got some blowback and some pushback from his board and said, well, what if they just like, give the money to themselves? And I was like, well, that would be really interesting data, but they didn't. In fact, what they did was choose to collaborate together on a public messaging and strategic communications campaign.
That's very helpful. This is about understanding the levers for change, isn't it? I guess. Celestin.
Hey everyone, sorry about that. It took me a while to find my mute button there. Thanks for that presentation, it's fantastic. I wanted to ask a question a bit about your experience in relation to the kind of building the evidence base part of the model. So in the UK and in the US for sure, there are like extreme inequalities in who is able to produce evidence or what people produce, whether or not it's even seen as evidence. And it strikes me that if we start with an evidence base that is excluding particular groups, that we might ill-define the problem. So we might not even, we're building the wrong type of field for the wrong problem, if you see what I mean. So I wonder what your experiences are with that and trying to, I suppose, bring different voices and different kinds of evidence to bear.
What an awesome question. Thank you. Emma, I have a few just starter thoughts because, I will say one of the key headlines from our first big report on this, the 2020 field building report, was that population level change means equity has to be at this, like populations aren't just like averages moving, right? Like we actually have to center equity in this work, or we're never actually going to get to population level change. And we as a team, even as we elevated, there was a small handful of fields that got to kind of the far right side of the population level change page. But each of those, if you disaggregate the results, like even smoking, we get to like 95% reduction in teen smoking in the US. You disaggregate the results, who was left out? Our indigenous communities, our young people of color. And like these are groups that were not centered in the field's original problem statement or design of the field's work in the 90s. And so we see that again, even in palliative care, which was a field that came together, it didn't exist. Like who was left out? Our Black communities, our Latinx communities. And so as we as a team were grappling with this, it's like it's really important to celebrate the field's progress, but what if we actually applied the lens of targeted universalism? Like what if back in the 80s and 90s with some of these historical examples, we had said, okay, well, the problem is actually that the system was designed for the inequity that we see in these outcomes, and let's define the problem that way and solve it that way, which means, Celeste, to your point, like elevating a much broader research and evidence base, practical insights, stories from community, like a much different definition of how we think about and look at evidence. And I guess, our encouragement to field building efforts now, and we see this much more now as common practice, like even in teen pregnancy, same thing, but that field catalyst evolved their approach to embrace not just the universal goal, but that targeted universalism piece, that like we're not actually going to get to population level outcomes unless we center those that have been most marginalized and minoritized by our systems today. That's what will actually get us to population level and durable shifts. And really effective field catalysts are at, I would say, at the bleeding edge of like our sector's work to figure out what is the evidence required to help us get there. And there are a few specific examples. I can put a couple links in chat that I think are like really leading on that and on that question.
Thank you. So take another couple of questions. So Heather.
Great, thank you. Really interesting discussion. I have two related questions. So the first is picking up actually on Celestine's point. When does a diverse ecosystem of people working towards a change or to resolve a problem, when does it become a field? Or is it when it fits the characteristics that have been developed to identify it as a field, which for me then explains why certain groups are left out, or could explain why certain groups are left out. So when does it become recognized as a field is the first question. And then the second question, which follows on from that, is how should or do funders ensure that their resources, including money, go to those within the field that need it rather than just going to the field or those who have the loudest voices or the most power within the field? So those would be my two questions. Thank you.
I love that. I'm happy to start. Leah, I know you're putting some stuff in the chat. Well, it's a really great question about like when is a field a field? I mean, I think, when some of our research, one of the sort of fundamental questions in the earliest emerging stages of a field under that, you think about those observable characteristics under a field level agenda is like, do people self-identify as working on something in common? And I think doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. It's like, do we sort of agree that we're working on something together? Then I think that prompts the question like, okay, but if we want to work on that thing together, who else needs to be at the table? So it should immediately prompt like a deeper question about that gets at some of the really equity centered dimensions of this work. Heather, I'm blanking on your second question, which I thought was so good, and I had a thought. Could you remind me?
Sorry, there were long questions, so I apologize. So then my second question was, how do or should funders ensure that the resources they have go to the actors within the field who need it most, rather than those who are just more visible or have a louder voice or have more power? Thank you.
Yeah, I love that question, and I think even just asking it is like a wonderful first step. The second thing I'd say is we see a lot of field catalysts. We were surprised by this in our research, taking on regranting, because when field catalysts take on regranting, they take it on for a very specific sort of strategic reason to meet the need of the field, which may be that funders don't have visibility or connections or relationships such that they're able to fund the full set of potential leaders who need to be a part of the work. And so that's, I think, one way that we see funders supporting a broader set of actors than those that just are sort of the typical organizations, is to be in conversation and partnership with field catalyst organizations to say, like, does it make sense to play a regranting role? If you were to do that, how would you approach it and who would you fund? And maybe even as an intermediate step, just to say, who else should I be talking to in the field as a funder, to start to broaden my own understanding and aperture of what this work requires and who needs to be engaged.
Great. Thank you. Dee?
Thank you. I think a lot of the questions or the responses just answered what I was going to ask. And it's 1:30 in the morning, so just bear with me for a sec while I get my head straight. So one thing we're noticing both in Australia and in the global work that we do is more governments and authorities are starting to understand that place-based does not necessarily mean community-led. And they're starting to kind of go to that kind of next level, and instead of just using pretty words, actually looking at how can we be community-led. So thinking of field building and how field building discovers what community cares about enough to act on. And so I think I've heard that in a few of the responses there about who decides the issues that community want to work on, and when do you get to the point of asking community members, because we know that working alongside communities and consulting with them or talking with them, it takes time, and there's quite often funders will have a timeline. So yeah, just wondering about those things. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dee, and gosh, thank you for being here middle of the night. One other connection that I would make on that specific question is, we at Bridgespan have these multi-year initiatives. This is one, and we only have a small handful of these topics that we think are most important and will unlock the greatest impact in our sector. And community-driven change is another one of the handful of topics that we've elevated, and that is led out of our Africa and India offices. And Emma and I are in this ongoing dialogue with how do we help connect these dots between field building and community-driven change. We often call field building, we call our work, our shorthand for it is equitable field building. And when we say equitable and when we say equity-centered work, this is what we mean. We actually mean that it is those who are closest to these inequitable systems are speaking into what the problem is and how we define it and what the vision is and all these things. And I think when we look at really equitable field building efforts that center those who are closest to the problems and bring that lived experience to the work, that those examples illuminate for us the power of community-driven work tethered to broader fields and these field building efforts, because in those examples we see one person described it as multi-sector and multi-dimensional bridges, bridges over here from communities into philanthropy, and field catalysts really help translate, bridges across between communities. And so I think there's to the infrastructure point, just such an opportunity to continue to figure out what does that kind of infrastructure look like? How does it scale? That's always the question we get from funders. Really understand want to center communities, but how do you actually scale the kind of infrastructure that is in constant action learning mode with a lot of different places? We think some field catalysts are literally doing that. Some are global in doing that. Ask them, it's, I think sometimes this question by funders is asked in an academic way, and it's get out in the field and actually ask the folks who are doing it. We think there are examples of that in country and globally as well.
Yeah,
and I'm actually going to pop another report in lot of links in the chat. Let us know if you want to follow up on any of these. We know we're throwing a lot at you.
I suppose we just add to that before I bring Mike in is that we see a kind of a tension somehow in the mood music, I guess, around this. Partly that the sense of communities have to originate, and therefore everything has to be unique to the community's preferences. We don't see that actually a tension between that and connecting people of common cause. It's where I guess it originates, isn't it? There's an integrity question that if communities originate, it is something I really want to solve, then it only, by connecting them with others in a broader field, it only kind of amplifies their impact, their learning, all the things we talked about at the top and we've sort of talked about today. So it's about, I guess, how we kind of honor what is community led, but strengthen that by connecting those communities in a field. But Mike, let me bring you in, and then we'll go into a plenary.
Thanks so much, everyone. And maybe this question, maybe I put it in the chat, maybe building on some of what Leah just alluded to about, I'm very conscious of the fact that some locally led initiatives then butt up against the institutional designs that are around them, often in the statutory sector. And actually, therefore, sustaining long-term change is really, really hard. And it may be championed over shorter periods, but actually in terms of sustaining change is really hard. And there was a reference in one of the earlier slides to the adaptive, I think the phrase was adaptive infrastructure and connective tissue, that actually I think is key to long-term change and sustaining that, and that bridges across issues. And somebody put in the chat, I think, about the connected issues, the connecting circles, but also from local to national levels where decision-making needs to start to align in order to enable some of the change that we want to see for the long run. And I just wondered whether you could comment on where you've seen what that kind of connective tissue and adaptive infrastructure, put some flesh on what those phrases might mean if we're trying to sustain change.
Yes, great. Thank you, Mike. And in our research, before we were going deep on this idea of the field catalyst organization, we kind of generally thought about that infrastructure as the intermediary organizations, funder collaboratives, relationships that existed. It was kind of a broad category. And very quickly, this idea of the field catalyst became really central to that notion of adaptive infrastructure because it was a type of entity that was specifically an infrastructure building mission. That is the work of the field catalyst, not to deliver programs, but to ensure that field level infrastructure is there. And so sometimes I answer this question like, so what do field catalysts do every day? What is then the work of that infrastructure building? And it is often there is convening, there is strategic communication, sometimes which includes back to Celestine's great question, like translation of the evidence and knowledge base and research base and elevating learning and learning agenda. Like, what are the things we know? What do we don't? What do we not know? And so those are there's a content body to the work alongside the relationship building and kind of creating space for relationships across different types of actors. I don't like the phrase strange bedfellows, but a lot of field catalysts use it as like when we convene, we're trying to get these folks that maybe were never in a room together so we can actually see, is there hope for a shared agenda here? Like, are we onto something together? What can we work on together? And so a lot of that infrastructure is about that gathering of the field, that learning with the field and playing back to the field. Here's where we are. Like, let's celebrate this progress. And here are the headwinds we're up against. Let's figure out what our agenda is going forward. And one example that I think is interesting to look at here in the US is marriage equality, because the field catalyst was launched with a time limit on it. Like, they were I think embrace the phrase built to win, not to last. And we saw some in our early research, some examples of field catalysts that were like kind of these time limited infrastructure building entities. And, you know, indeed, like there were court cases, all the things like marriage equality was declared a win. And that field catalyst sunset. But then, like, systems self-correct, right? Like, there are these like backlashes to progress like that. And then there was that field catalyst was not there anymore as adaptive infrastructure to meet the new headwinds and new challenges and new moments. And even evolved to look at like the broader LGBTQ plus rights movement, many folks in which wouldn't have said marriage was the goal. And so there's like a broader body of work at play. So that's why we like that frame of evolving and sustaining on the right side. And that's where that adaptive infrastructure is in constant learning and assessing mode and is like, okay, let me call all the 30 folks I'm in close relationship with across the field to see like, where are we now? Where do we need to go from here? How do we keep funders close to the work because we know there's a new thread around every corner? And so that's what we see a lot of the infrastructure doing and that role that they're playing. And I would invite others, I'm sure you all, as I name some of those activities, there may be other examples or ways that you see that type of infrastructure play out in the fields that you all work in. So would invite others as well.
Thank you, Leah. And actually, that's exactly what I was going to go on to, is to ask a little bit, go on to a discussion really around where we see some of this work evolving in the UK and how we're seeing the sort of the practice of field building either in its full glory or elements of it sort of evolving, and how you see it sort of, how you see this some of this work sort of relating to what you're doing now. But before we sort of open it up, Holly, I'm putting you on the spot, but Holly Donner from Paul Hamlin wrote a wonderful blog that caught our eye, really looking at called Changing Funding Practices for a Changing World, based on a visit that she's done to the States. And I wonder, Holly, if I could invite you just to share a couple of reflections from your visit and the things that you wrote in your blog, really by way of a counterpoint to some of the things that Bridgespan have talked about around field building.
Great, thank you, Jo. Yeah, really happy to do that. And there's just such a lot of synergy, I would say. I think what I was trying to talk about in the blog was really, we can become very sort of obsessed with how we operate as organizations and become very internally focused, which I would guard against. But equally, the way in which we fund is really important. So there's a kind of tension and a polarity there that I think we have to sort of keep noticing. And I think for me, the kind of connection really is this idea of fields and problems that are bigger than projects or, organizations that we fund. And therefore the sort of nature of how we actually situate ourselves into that sort of ecology is really important, and therefore our practice is really important. So in a way, I think I sort of, I started with this sort of thinking about, discussions about funder practice are kind of tedious and navel gazing, but then came back to actually, no, where we situate ourselves in this kind of world is really critical. And I think it's, as we've just heard, it's it's trying to sort of take that more helicopter view across the kind of problems and dynamics that we're working with. And I think one of the things that we've talked about quite a lot is the organizations that we fund might not be the same people who need to be doing the field building, as in the skills might be different. So how do we as funders actually kind of recognize that and think about, what are the skills that, where could we see the gaps, and kind of think about different organizations or different kind of capacity that we can bring into the system that actually enables this kind of field building practice, rather than, if you like, imposing this as another thing that we're expecting organizations to do when they're actually really, really focused on sort of doing the doing. So I think that's one thing that I would offer. It's just sort of how do we as funders sort of ask the question about whether we have the right people in the room to do this kind of task. And I think that speaks to this idea of kind of how do we cultivate a kind of the sort of generosity necessary to do this work well. And for me, that also comes from this idea of, we can be generous when we're not operating in the space of scarcity. So how do you actually resource entities sufficiently that there is more capacity to be generous? And I think that's something that I've really heard from this discussion as well. So, how do we sort of acknowledge that there might be different skills involved in field building as opposed to running and doing delivery? How do we as funders sort of fund people properly in order to cultivate generosity? And then another thing I was sort of thinking about is some of the tasks that we've talked about this afternoon, like the evidence building and defining the problem and really being able to centre equity. I think those are all things that funders can sort of observe and offer some new capacities into. And I suppose what I would say is thinking about the funder as taking that, again, that kind of helicopter view in order to be able to take on the resourcing of some of those roles, not necessarily to do it ourselves, but to actually say, okay, there's an evidence base that's missing here. How can we come in and sort of help provide that? We're not centering the right voices here. We're not doing that work properly. How can we, as a funder, come in and kind of resource that sort of function? I think there's been a really interesting discussion about the working with government or not, or where do we centre the sort of mainstream of the system? And again, I think we've got independent funders have got a really kind of particular viewpoint where we can sort of bring in those other voices and those other actors, but also observe where they're not the right people to be driving the change, because systems, as we've heard, sort of they revert to the status quo. So how do we sustain that helicopter view in order to see, well, actually, the system here is just creating a pattern that is going to kind of reinforce its own sense of what the problem is, its own sense of what is needed, and not do that sort of centering of equity. So we could sort of be that quite an important bridge, I think, between those different parts, those different sort of parts of the system. So yeah, I mean, those were the kind of things that felt to me like the real kind of synergy with what we're thinking about. I mean, we've got an infrastructure fund, which we call the Backbone Fund. And the point of that fund really is to try and think about what are the kind of capacities that are going to be needed in this sort of a future where we can sort of thrive as civil society. What kind of systems and infrastructure are we going to need, and who's out there already doing that work? And I think, as much as anything, what we recognize is there's just not enough people in that kind of space. I think has been touched on a lot already. The actual there's so much need for more capacity to do thinking, to do bridge building, to convene conversations, to think about how you centre power. It's a field in itself in a way, and I think we're not going to kind of meet the problems that we're facing across all of these different perspectives unless that is kind of resourced as a thing in and of itself. So I think that, yeah, my sort of takeaway for us as funders is to think about how do we make the case for that capacity and think about how we can integrate that into all our kind of funding portfolios, and then think very critically about our role as funders in taking some of the work off the shoulders of the organisations to do some of that gap filling. And I think it depends what kind of funder you are. I would say for us as a fairly large, open grant maker, that's quite different. It's quite a different kind of way of being. And it will be different for other funders in the space. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, it was, Holly, yeah. And I think just one of the things you hint at is perhaps that it's not just the job of one funder, but in the very nature of building a field, it's bringing other people together, isn't it? And perhaps that's not just, it's not just one funder that needs to come together, particularly for very large issues. You also make the great point that reflect, I think Leah said earlier, is that this is about pushing missions, not just responding to them. And I wonder what came into my mind at times. I wonder what the equivalent of the teen pregnancy issue for the UK feels like at the moment. What's the galvanizing issue that feels like the issue of the day that would galvanize the interest of many funders and many organizations? So I don't know if there's any reflections. I'm conscious we haven't got that many minutes together left on in the time, but I don't know, anybody else like to share any reflections and thoughts?
So I was just thinking, Jo, in answer to that question, that I think anti-racism might well be that issue locally in community, because actually we know there's going to be more violence if we don't tackle that, and certainly, funders can centre equity in that conversation and field build in a way that works with what the communities themselves want to address. So that would seem to me to be the conversation a lot of funders are having at the minute. And I think the trick is moving that on from a responsive grant making program to much more of a how are we building a collective and collaborative field there. And I think definitely the narrative shift, some of those big initiatives pointed to, is really important there. So to me, that's the thing that spans the political, the social, the environmental, the economic as an issue. But I mean, obviously there are many others as well, but I can see that would be something that would have a lot of power, both locally and nationally. And it's certainly something that local motion places are sort of thinking of and leaning into with work to sort of be a pro-inclusion city, or really think about kind of how they lean into the anti-racist conversation locally.
Yeah.
So that's just my 2 pennies. And there's lots of great work, and I love people pointing to Barking and Dagenham Collective, and lots of others in the chat as well are doing great work. And hopefully we're trying to do that in local motion as well, which is a collaboration of funders and places.
I mean, I guess the other thing just to say is I think we find in our work that there is a struggle for lots of infrastructure organisations of many types that aren't doing direct work to secure core funding, because it's less attractive to at least some funders than putting money into work for things that touch communities and have direct outcomes. So I wonder whether any other reflection of any other funders around the restrictions on funding a type of a catalyst, which is another type of infrastructure organisation, and what the limiting factors are. And any other questions? Yeah, Alex.
Thanks. So I couldn't find the hand up bit icon. So thanks for seeing me. Yeah, so I work with a program called Shaping Places for Wellbeing, and it's really interesting because I think a lot of the things we're trying to do really follow a lot of this field building process, and it's not something I'd ever come across. And I'm reflecting a little bit. I think I put in the chat, we kind of started from a local authority base. I work for the Improvement Service, who supports local authorities in Scotland. So we started from that basis and kind of built outwards. And we talk a lot about kind of systems work, system thinking, multiple overlapping systems. But the term field is quite interesting, I think. And we came across a lot about how do we involve the third sector. We know that the third sector, we know that community-based organisations are a really important part of this system. How do we involve them? How do we involve them well? And I still think we haven't quite cracked it in terms of that power dynamic. But I did wonder about that term field and whether that would have been helpful for people in terms of building that field. So I suppose my question is around how many people within the UK use that term field building, and have people found it helpful in engaging third sector community organisations and perhaps addressing some of that kind of differential power dynamic?
I don't know, but I'd love to hear anybody else's reflections on that. We know from collective impact, for example, it can be a bit Marmite, can't it? Some people go, that's great, it's a framework, it's a way of thinking of it, and others feel it's a restriction, more of an artificial construct. So I don't know whether anybody's got any reflections. If not, what I'm going to suggest, just by way of not stopping the conversation, but just it'd be great to get a sense of how people would like to carry on the conversation, either individually, in groups, whatever. So if it's okay, what I'm going to do is attempt at least to launch a poll, just to really ask for those who'd like to tell us what your kind of what your thoughts are really on. You can answer, you can tick as many as you like, but we just like to know where the energy in the room is really for carrying on exploring field building in some way. And then we can kind of put on whatever events or make connections, whatever it means to move that forward. Just while we're doing that, and then we've got 4 minutes left. So apart from thanking contributors, any other final comments from anybody about how this lands with you? What your takeaways are? What perhaps your concerns are? Otherwise, we'll have a moment of mindful silence while we do our poll, which is also all good. So while we're doing the poll, just say a very big thank you to Emma and Leah, who also got up. I didn't quite match Dee's heroic 1:30 in the morning, which I think deserves an award. That's the earliest or the latest. I'm not sure which way around it is that I've ever had anybody on an event. But Emma and Leah have also got up so ungodly 6:30 in the morning from San Francisco or something like that. So thank you for your contribution and wisdom. We've worked with you for now a few months, and it's always a joy and also always really informative. So we thank you very much, and we will be using the poll really to follow up and see where the interest is. And we will, by the look of it, there is some interest about field building and how it might work in the UK. From our point of view, that's also finding out where field building is happening in part or in whole in the UK, just so we understand how because we know it is. We've been keen-eyed, as you might imagine, with this interest, and we've certainly seen some elements of field building happening. And Emma, if you're still on, you've made the comment, that's partly the role of combined authorities. We agree. I think there are entities, government and others, who are more naturally doing field building as part of their work. So we need to understand how that's happening in the way that Emma and Leah have talked about today. So thank you very much. 2 minutes of your life back, and we hope to see you at future events like this, or we'll be reaching out to those who have an interest in learning more to carry on the conversation. So thank you for your time today.